This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.
Support for this program comes from the Gail and Tom Benson Charitable Foundation, committed to funding educational causes.
Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, there was the shock of the damage. Then there was the challenge of the recovery. And this, the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, we can look back at resilience after a tragedy in which not just our neighborhoods, but our culture were threatened. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter, and at the time of Katrina, a reporter for WGNO-TV Channel 26. Robert Collins, political analyst for WVUE TV Fox 8 and urban studies professor at Dillard University. And Dennis Woltering, freelance journalist and, at the time of Katrina, a news anchor for WWL TV Channel 4. And that's what we're going to start off first, was the news biz and how difficult it was for you guys getting the information out to the community who desperately needed to get that information. Don, let's start with you talking about that.
I think one of the most important things to note is we have to remember Katrina hit before the smartphone did. We weren't texting. We didn't have a computer in our hands. So with communication out, that was very challenging. But we also, we lost our studio at ABC 26. We had elected, our news director at the time elected to leave a small group of staff in the city who ended up in the Superdome, and the vast majority else went to WBRZ in Baton Rouge and was working from there. I had found out that the morning prior to the storm, I know Errol wanted me to address this, that I was pregnant with my first child. So my normal desire to stay in the midst of a hurricane, which I thought was just going to be the normal 3 days without normal food or normal sleep, was lessened by that news. And we ended up scattering and then all gathering in Baton Rouge and coming back and forth and doing the news wherever we felt like it because we didn't have a studio. So we would have to park a big satellite truck, and they were large. They weren't just backpack systems at the time. It was an 18-wheeler practically, just doing the news wherever we'd call and say, here's a studio for the day. That's in the days following the storm. It was intense.
Intense, challenging. Dennis, what kind of experience did you have?
We had a different experience because our management really did a good job thinking ahead of time, and they sent half the staff to Baton Rouge, to LSU, to work in the studio at LSU campus, and half of us stayed here. And so Mike Hoss and I were anchoring that night when the storm was coming in, and we were on the air, and they came into the studio and said, we have to get out of here, we have to shut it down, throw it to Baton Rouge, because we had to go to the Hyatt Hotel before they closed the doors. So the staff that was in New Orleans went to the Hyatt. We spent the night there. We came out the next day, and it looked like it was a hurricane, but there was no flooding or anything like that right away. We went back to the station, and we started getting things going again. And so we were trading back and forth with Baton Rouge until we heard that the flooding was coming in. Yeah. And then we went over to the transmitter site in Gretna, and we worked out of there for a couple of days until the company felt lawlessness was becoming a concern and sent all of us to Baton Rouge to work out of LPB.
And so then, for months we weren't back here. So what was it like covering what was happening in your city when you really couldn't get in there necessarily to cover it?
Well, there was a lot of rumor happening at the time. What was happening at the airport, what was happening at the convention center, where the people were and getting picked up from. I remember driving in from Baton Rouge and going to the airport because Jesse Jackson was there, and there was something going on with Jesse Jackson at the people at the airport. And by the time we got to the airport, that news was old news and they had moved somewhere else. So it was just very challenging to try to figure out what was real, what wasn't real. Without being able to have full access to the city. And of course, we were all humans too. We hadn't seen our homes to know, were our homes okay? Were they going to be okay? We had all evacuated at the time with, probably not the right clothing. And
Right.
you know, so you're trying to function as a human, and you're also trying to get all the news out. And I think we all did, looking back, a phenomenal job. All 4 stations at the time, just trying to figure it out, not working out of your normal studios and your normal newsrooms, not with the resources we might have needed or wanted, and all get, you know, it was precious time when we would gather for a press conference somewhere in the French Quarter and actually see colleagues from our other stations and know, oh, you're okay, you know, because normally we see a lot of each other.
Yeah.
And this wasn't a story of just, you know, a hurricane, as we've been saying, okay, it comes, goes after about 3 or 4 days. This
Right.
is something that was #1 story for a long, long time.
And not only that, but some of our staff, and I'm sure some of your staff, lost homes, you know, and so they were concerned about that. Our news director and one of the reporters, Dave McNamara, had lost a home in Slidell, but they, you know, powered on right through.
Yeah, we had colleagues who lost homes in Lakeview and lost homes in Slidell and lost homes in Mississippi. And
Yeah, so you all were suffering through it as well as the rest of the community. I mean, personally, of course we all were. Such a very difficult time, which we hope never, ever to
Absolutely.
experience again. Did you want to say something?
I want to acknowledge radio, though, because this in many
Yes.
ways was radio's story, because radio is by battery, whereas TV, you got to be able to play when the electricity went out, and especially WWL, because it is so powerful. And with people spread out all over the state, that 50,000 watts kicked in. And those of you who remember Garland Robinette, I think this was his finest hour, because he had a whole afternoon slot. And he was the guy that was handing out all the information that you couldn't get anywhere else.
Right.
So radio played a very powerful
Yeah, it was
role.
really, really important for people to get that information.
At a certain point, we weren't on the air, we were on the internet.
Yeah.
That's where we're broadcasting.
And that was kind of new to everybody
Yeah.
at that
right there,
point, too.
people weren't really streaming yet, but we were.
And nor texting, you know. Okay, Dennis, so we're better protected now, so we are told, because a lot of money was put into what is called the Hurricane Risk Reduction System.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
Well, first of all, the system was only a system in the name. It was a piecemeal system, and there were a lot of problems with it. For example, we had eye walls instead of, and what they replaced those with eye walls along the drainage canals.
Right.
So when the water overtopped the wall, it eroded the other side, and the wall fell down. So they replaced those with T-walls, so that like this, a T-wall, so the
A bigger base.
the top is on the bottom there. And so if the water overtopped, it wouldn't erode the other side. And also, they found on the east side of the 17th Street Canal, almost a year before Katrina, neighbors noticed water in their backyards. And they called the Sewage and Water Board, and the Sewage and Water Board went out and checked and said, it's not our pipes, it's not pipes. Well, it turned out that the sheet piling going into the canal wasn't going deep enough. It didn't go all the way to the bottom of the canal, and the bottom of the canal was sand. So the water was seeping into these backyards of these neighbors. Well, when the canals filled, and that wasn't just the 17th Street Canal, other canals had the same issue. When the water swelled up, it made it so much easier to topple those flood walls. So when they went back, they pushed those piles deeper below the base of the canal. And also the canals no longer, the water drains out, but it can't come back in.
Right,
So
we have the big pumps now.
they big pumps. And also they armored the system in some places. So on some of the earthen levees, for example in Algiers, they put concrete blocks on the crown of the levees, and on the land side they put a plastic matting that they anchored, and then they sprayed it with mulch and put hay on top of it, and eventually grass grew through it, and it became more stable. So if the water overflowed the levee, it wouldn't necessarily wash away the other side of the levee. So it's a much better system, but it's a risk reduction system. And the other thing that happened was that they built these huge complexes. The West Closure Complex at the end of the Algiers and Harvey canals, which has the largest pumps in the world to pump water downstream, and it also has gates to prevent storm surge from coming into the Algiers and Harvey canals. And then on the east side, they have the Inner Harbor Navigation Canal, and that works along with Seabrook floodgate complex to prevent flooding from the from Lake Warren and from the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, which is closed now.
Right.
That was another issue that came up because people said it was like a funnel, funneling that water into these areas, New Orleans East, St. Bernard, and that kind of thing. So I think it's a much better system than it was, but it's only, as you said, a risk reduction system.
Right, exactly. And then, of course, there's the surge barrier, the big wall across Lake Bourne. That was a major part also.
Yeah, that's part of the Inner Harbor, navigation canal. It's 26 feet high. It's a 1.8 mile long structure.
Right.
It's the most expensive structure they've ever built.
Yeah, $14 billion, of that time dollars, too, gone into this system, which we are told protects us a whole lot more, but it's a risk reduction system.
It's a risk reduction
I think we could feel a little bit better about it, but bottom line is make your plans if we see a really big storm coming our way. Just know what you're going to do about it.
If you're told to evacuate, you may want to do that.
and leave early if you are, too, because they're not so sure about contraflow because of storms just intensifying so quickly they don't have time for contraflow. So, all righty, Dennis, thanks a lot. Let's go on over now. Robert, you wanted to talk about the resiliency of our community, resiliency of our area here, particularly in Orleans. But this impacted the whole metro area.
Sure. So for the past 15 years, I've been working with the data center and the Brookings Institution out of Washington, D.C. And every 5 years, starting at Katrina 5, a group of scholars comes together and we put out a series of articles and reports that talk about the current state of the city. So so this year I did an article called The Politics of Resilience, and it looks at the current state of civic engagement in the metro area. And basically, there are three takeaways I would argue as far as how we're doing 20 years after Katrina. Number one, I would say our community organizations, our community groups are very strong, and they became that way basically because of after Katrina they had to survive. So I argued, that right after Katrina we probably had the best educated citizen planners in the United States. People learned about eminent domain and land use and zoning and all these kind of things. And so a lot of those neighborhood organizations still exist. They're not as active now because they don't need to be, but they still exist. And so we have a very active network of neighborhood organizations. Number two, we have a very active network of nonprofits that came about after Katrina, basically because they had to take over a lot of the basic services of government. A lot of services, housing and food pantries and health care. A lot of these services had to be taken over by nonprofits. In fact, there was a study done that showed that there are more incorporated nonprofits in the New Orleans metro area than any other metropolitan statistical area, with the exception of Philadelphia.
Really?
So in terms of per capita, we're second in the country only to Philadelphia in the number of actually incorporated nonprofits and groups within the city. So that's the good news. The bad news is that we've seen a drop off in political activity and political participation. In the mayoral election right before Katrina in 2022, turnout was about 44% in the primary and 44% in the runoff. We haven't gotten close to 40% since then. It's like the last time when Mitch Landrieu ran for an open seat in 2010, we had turnout was about 33%, and then when LaToya Cantrell ran for a vacant seat 8 years later, turnout was about 32% in the runoff. 32% in the primary and 33% in the runoff. And then, of course, in the last gubernatorial election, we saw, turnout was low statewide, it's about 36%, but in New Orleans, it was about 27%. Wow. Only about 27% turned out last gubernatorial. So people just don't turn out to vote anymore. And people ask why. Part of that is because a lot of the neighborhood organizations, the political organizations like Bowl, Life, Soul, Coup. They were based on sort of ancestral ties in those neighborhoods. And that all got scrambled and taken apart in Katrina, and people came back, but they're living in other places. So a lot of those ancestral neighborhood political ties got ripped out. So you don't have that get out the vote effort there. I mean, but I think a lot of it is just that people just became displeased by government, and sort of a set of sort of hopelessness set in, and so they started going to neighborhood groups or to nonprofits or to other places for government services, and so a lot of people have basically just dropped out of the political process now.
But there's a good side too, not always, but sometimes people are less inclined to vote because they feel less threatened, right? The Duke Edwards election, people felt threatened, okay? And they turned out to vote on that, But if they feel everything's okay, so.
Yeah, and I think that's true. If we look at the big corporate cities that we compare ourselves sometimes to, like Houston and Atlanta, Dallas, they all actually have very low rates of voter turnout, actually lower than ours. But they seem to be doing economically. So yeah, I think that's a good point as well. I think it's a combination with people. I think they feel like politics is sort of disconnected from their daily lives, good or bad. Either they're not threatened by it, disconnected, or they don't think it can help them, disconnected. So I think there's a disconnect there. But I would argue in the long run, I think that's a harmful place to be from a civic engagement standpoint. And so I always try and encourage people to participate in the voting process.
Right, to go vote.
Yes,
everybody
should vote every election.
All right. Thanks a lot, Robert. And Errol, you wanted to talk about, after the storm, how, this area recovered with the help of many Hispanic workers who came here.
Overwhelming help. I think this is one of the great stories of Katrina. I remember coming back to our house and nothing worked. I mean, and then and of course you're competing with everybody who needs help, who needs painters and carpenters. And there was a knocking on the door. There was a guy named Jose who we'd known because he'd done some painting for us, and he wanted to work. How can I help? And the great thing about him is, like everything we said, he replied, "I can do that." Right? I mean, there was no resistance. There was no union rules or anything. Right now, I can do that, and he could. And immediately, we needed a plumber. And the plumber said, "Well, we can't do any work under your house until you get somebody to check to see if there are any dead animals or syringes." Well, that was not work that I wanted to do, okay? But Jose, I can do that, okay? And he got his friends and they checked. But anyway, the can-do attitude, it was these guys who wanted to work. You really felt for them. And one side I'll always remember is during that period of time in the morning, passing by the home supply places like Lowe's, and
Home Depot.
Yeah, and seeing all these guys just sitting in the lot and waiting for somebody to come pick them up and take them some places. And one time I was passing by, and by accident I slowed down because I thought I saw somebody I knew, and they were all running to me, okay? I couldn't even fit in my car. But it was very encouraging. I mean, just to see those kind of people in the work they did. And I'll tell you, they saved New Orleans. Well, they certainly hastened the recovery. Yes. It would have taken a whole lot longer and been a lot more expensive had it not been for those people.
Because gutting houses and emptying out refrigerators was not something that a lot of people wanted to do, that's for sure. And so those workers who came into the city to help us do that, like you said, it did speed up the recovery. And of course, there was a lot of debris that they were clearing out. So, how did that work for us? We all can remember on West End that the white goods.
Stories high.
White goods.
It was a Basin Central, what is it, New Basin Canal Park, right along West End Boulevard. It was like 2 stories high.
Right.
It was incredible. But the cleanup cost more than $2 billion. It was the largest debris cleanup in history up to that point. I think Hurricane Sandy may have equaled that. But the costs were high in part because there was no competitive bidding, and some of the contracting companies, charged more than they would have otherwise if there had been competition, and also some of the contracting companies were accused of inflating their rates and that kind of thing. But it was a massive, complex effort. I mean, they had to segregate the debris because some of it was toxic and hazardous, and they had to go to different landfills and to get rid of it. So it was a huge effort. They estimated that 60 million cubic yards of debris was removed from Louisiana, 40 million cubic yards in Mississippi. And if you remember, I mean, you were talking about emptying refrigerators. There were refrigerators on
Taped
curbs
up.
all over the city. I mean, whether you were flooded or not, you had trees down, you had fences down, parts of a roof were down. Everyone had debris, and the curbside pickup was pretty quick, really. I mean, they came around on sort of a regular basis
Do
and
you
took it up.
remember the smell, though?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Just
Terrible.
the rotting fridges up
Yeah.
and down. The
Yeah.
smell was.
Well, and the danger that people
Yeah.
would
Right.
wind up inside of one of those things.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, you can just, every house needed to be gutted. Certainly, in a good part of this area. Just remember all of those debris piles out in front of just individual houses. That was a massive job.
Yeah. And there was also, I mean, immediately after the storm, there were trees down on roads, power poles down. So it was debris all over the place. So it's understandable it would be a huge, complex job. But I think waste and fraud drove up the price.
Well, and also, it wasn't just in Orleans Parish, and certainly Jefferson Parish, too.
Yeah.
They were out of power. A lot of homes flooded there, too. So it was really metro-wide.
Yeah.
And, of course, St. Bernard Parish hit so hard, too. Just memories we just as soon not have. And so another big part of our recovery that maybe didn't work as well as everybody wanted it to was the road home.
Yes, so the Road Home program was a program that was administered by the state, but was actually funded by the feds. It was funded by community development block grant funds from HUD, and the whole theory behind the Road Home program was it was supposed to provide gap funding. So funding that insurance did not cover, it was supposed to provide a gap so that you could rebuild your home. The problem with it was, a lot of people argue the problem with it is how they computed the grants. The grant the grant money was determined by calculation based on the lesser of two things, either the actual cost of rebuilding or the pre-storm assessed value of your house. And so for most people, that was going to be the pre-storm assessed value of their house. And so a lot of people argued that it was sort of discriminatory against African Americans, or really just against poor people in general, certainly against poor whites, working class whites as well, in that the amount of money that you were going to get based on the pre-storm assessment value of your home was not going to be enough to rebuild your home, simply because construction costs skyrocketed after Katrina. I mean, all of us who are here rebuilding after that remember how the price of lumber skyrocketed, the cost of pipes, the cost of everything just went through the roof. And so the grants for a lot of people just were not enough to cover that cost. And so it just sort of perpetuated this narrative where, okay, well, if you're upper middle class or middle class, white collar person, you're probably okay. But if you're a working class person, as usual, nobody's coming to help you. You're just kind of on your own. So it just sort of perpetuated that narrative that between the haves and the have-nots that we saw all through Katrina. Now to be fair, the program did allocate about $9 billion to about 130,000 people, and there are some people that did well under the program, that got the money they needed, that were able to rebuild the homes. So it did help a lot of people. Let's be clear. It would be unfair to say they didn't help people, but it's just, as usual, the working class and the poor it didn't get them where they needed to be able to rebuild.
And it could be really a very slow go and a frustrating one for so many individuals, because people were in homes that had been handed down from generation to generation.
Yes.
And it was difficult for them to prove it was their property.
Sure. And the bureaucracy was so thick. There were so many layers to bureaucracy. I always say, my sister called it the road block home, program, and that's what we called it in my family. And I had to go through it. My siblings had to go through it. They called it the road block home, just because. So you had to prove ownership. There were generational homes. A lot of people didn't have the deed to their homes because they had inherited from their grandparents or their great grandparents. And there was just so much bureaucracy that there were a lot of people that ended up eventually getting some money, but they lost their homes because it took them so long to get their money that that it was basically too late to to save the home because they had to have somewhere to live. So a lot of people just sold the land as is, got what they could get for it, and then just moved somewhere else.
There was a massive recovery program, though. How much money went into that home?
About $11 billion went into it, and about $9 billion was spent, and there was a lot of litigation. It was a very litigious program. Okay, so some people took grant money with the intention of raising their homes. There were grants to do that, but then it turned out their homes were not structurally sound, that they could not raise them. So it turns out they spent the money on other things. And then the Road Home Program lawyers came after those people and actually sued them to get the money back. Now, fortunately, those people got a good group of lawyers. There was a class action suit, and a couple of years ago, and literally this was just resolved a couple of years ago, the Road Home people dropped those lawsuits trying to claw back the money from those people that were unable to raise their home for architectural or engineering reasons.
Just bad memories there, bad memories.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, dealing with your insurance company, if you had insurance company.
Yeah.
Had insurance wasn't always an easy thing to do. So, okay, now we're going to remember some people that really stand out to you. E.
Yeah, I want to recall Ann Milling, who is uptown social person and also community activist, and she organized a group called Women of the Storm. And they stormed to Washington. They all got together and they went and then they visited anybody with any kind of power, and they met with them to help raise interest in New Orleans and finance.
And she's working on it still regarding the coastal restoration. Okay.
I want to just talk about the thousands of people, both local and far spread, who volunteered for organizations that are still now active. The St. Bernard Project, the Lower Nine, a group from my church called Rhino, Rebuilding Hope in New Orleans, that formed in that disarray and still exists. St. Bernard Project has now to date rehabilitated 7,000 homes nationwide. Wow.
Wonderful, wonderful work for them. Robert.
So my newsmaker is Ed Blakely. He was the recovery czar under Ray Nagin. He was totally over his head. He famously said when he came into town, "We're going to have cranes in the skyline by next September." Cranes in the skyline. Well, those cranes never showed up to this day. Errol and I are still waiting for the cranes to show up.
Aren't we all?
So and so he was just he's an academic by trade, and he lacked the construction experience to get the job done. So it was just a big mistake.
And he was a specialist in Australia. I mean, he knew a lot about Australia.
Okay, we need to go to Dennis.
Doris Vaucher, who was superintendent of schools in St. Bernard Parish, she stayed in the high school when the storm came in. As you told me earlier, she went up to the second floor when the flooding came in. She got the schools, they had 8,000 students in those schools in St. Bernard. She got the schools opened in a month in St. Bernard Parish with trailers and had 300 students when Orleans took a year to get schools back open.
She's definitely a hero, and that system has done so well. She's rebuilt the system beautifully. Okay, and I think she's going to retire soon. Thanks a lot, guys. Very, very interesting conversation. Memories that we have about Katrina that maybe we don't want to have. But thank you all for watching. See you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
Support for this program comes from the Gail and Tom Benson Charitable Foundation, committed to funding educational causes.
This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.